Hello listeners, I am Dr. Anuj Kumar Sharma from Center for Advanced Studies, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam Technical University, Lucknow. So, in this lecture we will take the introduction to IC engines. So, this is the second unit of this particular subject, fundamentals of mechanical engineering and mechatronics. So, this is compulsory subject to all first year students. So, in this lecture we will take the following topics: introduction, then external versus internal combustion engines. उसके बाद we will take classification of IC engines, and then we will proceed to basic concepts of components of IC engines. So, as you all know, engines plays a very important role in our daily life. So, in every the medium, whether it is the transport medium or it is industry or it is space systems or the any type of transport like air transport, road transport or sea transport, water transport. So, we use these engines. So, first of all the questions comes in our mind, then what is engine, how should we define engines. So, basically engines is a device which transforms the chemical energy of a fuel into thermal energy and uses this energy to produce mechanical work. So, here we can see, so we have two important terms. So, this is the chemical energy of fuel, and what we are trying to get, it is the mechanical work. So, it means the device which is capable of converting one form of energy, that is the chemical energy of fuel, into the mechanical work. So, we can call it as engine. So, primarily we generally call these engines are heat engines, because heat is involved in this. So, if we talk about the classification, so we can classify the heat engines into two category. First is the external combustion engine and second one is the internal combustion engine. So, combustion is common term in the definition of engines. So, combustion means we are burning something. So, what we are burning? We are burning some fuel, we are burning some secondary or primary fuel to get the heat. So, that is why these engines are known as the heat engines. So, according to the the place of combustion, whether it is taking inside the engine cylinder or it is taking place outside the engine cylinder. So, according to that we can classify engines into two categories. So, external and internal combustion engines. So, external combustion engine is in which we are doing the combustion of air and fuel and which we are transferring this heat to the second fluid, which is the working fluid of the cycle. So, in the case of steam engines, what we do? So, for example, so the example of this external combustion engine is steam engine. So, what generally we do in the steam engines? We have coal and we burn this coal into some chamber, and because of that burning some heat is evolved out of the combustion and we transfer that heat to the secondary fluid or working fluid. So, in the in this steam engine, what is the working fluid? It is the water. In most of the cases it is water. So, we transfer the heat which we are getting after the combustion of fuel to the water, and by the absorption of that heat, this water converts into the steam, and then we use this steam to run the machine, or we can say the engine, where we are getting the mechanical work. So, it will go to the the piston cylinder assembly, where we supply the high pressure steam to the piston cylinder, and because of that high pressurized steam, it reciprocates the piston inside the cylinder like this. So, this is the piston and it is connected, I will discuss this in the detail, right. So, this is the connecting rod like this. So, it will go up and down. So, we will feed the steam to the cylinder from some ports, and it will try to push some pressure on the piston, and it will try to move the piston in this direction. Then just to complete the rotation, it will come up and come down, come up, come down. So, like this we will get the reciprocating motion of the piston. So, this way what we are doing? We are burning the fuel here, burning of fuel takes place here, and some heat is evolved which we are giving to the water. Then water converts into the steam, steam is doing the mechanical work, and on this shaft, this is the engine shaft, we are getting the rotation of this shaft. Reciprocation converts into the rotation with the help of connecting rod, that we will discuss later, but here we are getting the mechanical work. So, this is the external combustion engine, because the burning of fuel or combustion of fuel is taking place outside the engine cylinder. So, we are not burning the fuel inside this cylinder. So, that is why it is known as the external combustion engine. And in the case of internal combustion engine, what we do, the combustion of air and fuel takes place inside the cylinder, and which are used as the direct motive force. So, just in the case of diesel engines, petrol engines, what we do? We supply the air fuel mixture inside the engine cylinder. So, let us say this is the engine cylinder and this is the piston which is connecting with some arrangements, some mechanism is there. So, we have two ports or two valves. So, this is the inlet valve, this is the exit valve. I will discuss in detail in the subsequent slides. So, where what we do? Air plus fuel, fuel may be petrol, diesel, gasoline, anything. So, just we prepare the mixture of air and fuel, right. In the case of gasoline, we mix air with the fuel outside the engine cylinder, but in the case of diesel engine, we supply the the compressed air, or we supply the air inside the engine cylinder, then it is compressed and we spray the diesel. So, different mechanisms and different process of working is there for diesel engine and for petrol engine. But in the case of internal combustion engine, we are discussing this. So, what we are doing? We are supplying air and fuel mixture inside the engine cylinder. So, in the suction stroke, it comes inside the engine cylinder, then we compress it, and here we have the spark plug. So, what we do? We generate the spark when this mixture is compressed to a particular pressure, high pressure, then we generate the spark using the spark plug, and what happens at this moment? The ignition of the fuel takes place. So, it means what we are getting here? We are doing the combustion of fuel inside the engine cylinder. So, it means we are doing combustion inside the engine cylinder, that is why it is known as the internal combustion engine. So, broadly the engines can be classified into two categories: external combustion engine and internal combustion engine. Nowadays, we prefer the internal combustion engines over the external combustion engines because of their efficiency and their economy rates and their maintenance cost and their size. So, I will discuss this difference in the subsequent slides also. So, this is the comparison, already we have discussed a lot. So, if we take point by point, it will be combustion of air fuel is outside the engine cylinder, here the combustion of air fuel is inside the engine cylinder. So, if this question is asked, so we should try to write like this. The engines are, second point is, the engines are running smoothly and silently due to outside combustion, because the combustion of fuel is being taking place far away from the engine portion. So, that is why we are not getting that much of sound. So, there should be the smooth running. And in case of internal combustion engine, when you open the bonnet of a car, or if you will stand nearby the motorcycle, you will hear a lot of noise. So, it means they are very noisy, right. Next point is higher ratio of weight and bulk to output due to presence of auxiliary apparatus like ball air and condenser. So, these engines are heavy actually, because they are having so many components, like boiler is there in which we are boiling the water, and combustion furnace is there in which we are burning the fuel. So, it means we have a separate setup, but in the normal engines, in the internal combustion engines, we do not have these kind of separate arrangements. So, it means if we talk about the ratio of weight to the output, so it is low in compared to external combustion engine, and working pressure and temperature inside the engine cylinder is very low, because we are supplying the externally burned fuel inside the cylinder. So, it means we are not getting any high pressure or temperature inside the cylinder, but here in this internal combustion engines, in short it is known as the IC engines. So, I will use this abbreviation in the subsequent slides. So, IC engine means internal combustion engine. So, in IC engines the temperature and pressure is very high inside the engine cylinder. So, we have to use different alloys, special alloys to form the engine cylinders. Now, it can use cheaper fuels, very small points. Low efficiency is about 15 to 20%, means only 15 to 20% of the fuel energy is being converted into the mechanical work. Here this efficiency seems little bit higher, 30 to 40%. In external combustion engines, higher requirement of water, because we are using the secondary working fluid. So, in this we do not require the water. In IC engines we do not require. Now, due to the heaviness or bulkiness, they require high starting torque, because the engines are very heavy. So, they need high starting torque, but IC engines are not self starting. So, what we do generally, we use the batteries, right, for self ignition. What we do, we switch on the ignition by rotating the key just. So, it opens the circuit and it will give the rotary motion to the IC engine shaft, right, brake shaft, and then the ignition after some time, maybe 3, 4, 5 reciprocating motions of the cylinder of the piston inside the cylinder, the engine can start. Now, so there are will keep this lecture focusing on the internal combustion engines, because in our syllabus this engine is very important as far as the syllabus is concerned. So, we do not need to study the external combustion engines so much, because they are obsolete nowadays. Now, if we talk about the classification of the IC engines, so we have a lot of categories in which we can classify the IC engines. If we see, this is the first category. So, there are different criterions upon which we can classify the IC engines. So, first criteria is the basic engine design. So, this is the first criteria. So, according to this, we can classify engine into two categories. First is the reciprocating engine, and second is the rotary engine, right. So, reciprocating means ki if we see the general design of a engine. So, this is the cylinder basically. If you see the top view, it will be the circular, and this is the cylinder, and this is the engine, sorry, this is the piston. So, this is the piston. I will discuss all these points later on. So, it reciprocates. So, if it is reciprocating, so it means this kind of cylinders are this kind of engines are reciprocating engines. Second is a rotary engine. So, I hope you might have seen the engines of the or turbines of the fighter craft or aeroplane. So, in which we have the rotary engines. So, rotary engines means the rotors generally rotate about a particular shaft, and we are getting the supply of fuel, and it will try to rotate the blades. Because of the blade it gets rotate. So, those engines are rotary engines. So, according to the basic engine design, so we can classify into the two category. According to the type of fuel used, so it is very simple to understand. So, if we use the petrol as a fuel, it is a petrol engine. If we use the diesel as a fuel, it becomes diesel engine. If we use the gases just like gas turbines, so it becomes gas engine. So, generally nowadays just to avoid the pollution, what we use? We use the CNG, LPG. So, these fuels are less polluted fuels. So, we generally call these engines as gas engines. So, we need certain modifications and we adopt the modifications and we convert the conventional engines into the gas engines. Next is the alcohol engine. If we use the alcohol as a fuel, alcohol means we do not use alcohol as a direct fuel, but we mix alcohol or we blend the conventional fuels like petrol and diesel with the alcohol. So, ethanol, methanol etcetera they are used. So, these type of this category is based on the type of fuel used according to the number of strokes per cycle. So, I will discuss this in the maybe in the next lecture or at the end of this lecture if time will permit. So, 4 stroke and 2 stroke. So, according to the number of strokes per cycle. So, what does it mean? What is its meaning? I will explain this. What do you mean by stroke, stroke per cycle? So, according to that we this is very important classification, 4 stroke and 2 stroke. Next is according to the method of igniting the fuel, how we will ignite the fuel inside the cylinder, because we are talking about the internal combustion engines. So, it means we have to see the method of igniting the fuel, how we are burning the fuel. So, it is the spark ignition engine. So, this is also very important classification, because many times the questions are asked ki differentiate SI versus CI engines. So, we generally call spark ignition engines as SI engines and compression ignition engines as CI engines. So, this is very important classification. And next is the hot spot ignition engine. So, they are generally not popular engines, but most of the engines are spark ignition and compression ignition. So, spark ignition means it is petrol engine, and this compression ignition is the diesel engine. Now, next criteria of classification is the working cycle. So, this is little bit theoretical. So, there are two important cycles. One is the Otto cycle. So, it was invented by Otto scientist. So, this is the constant volume cycle. So, we will discuss this later on ki why it is known as constant volume cycle. So, if any engine works on the Otto cycle, it is known as the Otto cycle engine, or generally these engines are SI engines, spark ignition engines. Next is the diesel cycle, constant pressure cycle, in popularly we known as the constant pressure cycle, because the burning of fuel takes place at constant volume here. So, that is why it is known as the constant volume cycle. Here the burning of the fuel takes place at constant pressure. So, that is why, or we can say the heat supply is generally taken place at constant pressure in the case of diesel cycle. So, these are known as the compression ignition, and another one is the combination of these two, constant pressure and constant volume, means Otto and diesel when you will mix it. So, it becomes the dual combustion cycle. The semi diesel cycle engines generally we call them. So, this is the important classification. Next classification is according to the fuel supply and mixture preparation. So, how do we supply the fuel to the engine, and what is the method of getting that mixture prepared. So, generally it is carbureted type, in which we generally use the carburetors, right. So, carburetor generally mix the air with the fuel and then we supply it to the engine. Next is the injection type. Injection type means when we get the particular temperature inside the particular temperature and pressure inside the cylinder, then we inject the fuel inside the cylinder, then it becomes injection type. So, generally nowadays these technologies are being used most popularly just to get the maximum thermal efficiency of that particular engine. Next is the number of cylinders. So, you might have seen that motorcycle engine is the single cylinder engine, sometimes double cylinder engines, right. And when we talk about the engines of car, truck, buses, we call it as multi cylinder engines, because inside that engine we have more than one cylinder and piston arrangement. So, then it is known as the multi cylinder. If we want to have low power, right, just like in the case of scooters or 100 cc motorcycles. So, we use the single cylinder engines. Next is the method of cooling, because due to the burning of fuel inside the engine cylinder, the engine gets heated. So, just to make the engine cooler, so we can use these type of methods. So, most of the bicycle these motorcycle engines are air cooled, and if we want to draw more heat from the engine, then we generally use the water cooled. In case of car, we generally use different fluids, refrigerants, just to the keep engine cooler. Next is the speed of the engine. So, it is very vague kind of classification, slow speed, medium speed and high speed engines. According to the different speeds, we generally divide this into different categories. Now, the cylinder arrangement, it is important. Sometimes we get the vertical engines, because the cylinder is like this. So, if cylinder is in vertical direction, it becomes the vertical, and if cylinder is in this direction, it becomes the horizontal. Inline means the cylinders are in line with each other if we have multi cylinders. V type means if one cylinder is this, one cylinder is this. So, one piston will reciprocate in this direction, one piston will reciprocate in this direction. So, this type of engine is the V engines. Radial engines, if engines are in the radial direction like this, and opposed cylinder or piston engines. Opposed means if we have one cylinder here, piston reciprocates inside this, one in this direction, and this kind of is the opposed, means the pistons are facing each other. So, these are multi cylinders. Now, valve or port design and location. So, this is not so popular classification, depending upon the location and design of valve or port. Valves means by which we generally supply the fuel inside the engine cylinders, valves or ports. So, according to the location we can classify, and also due to the applications. So, it is also a simple classification, whether the engines are being used in the land transport, marine engines for propulsion of ships, aircraft engines. So, these are different categories according to the applications: automotive engines, marine engines, industrial engines, prime movers means motors, just to the rotate the electrical generators. So, these are some standard classification of IC engine. Now, this is important part where I want to have more focus. So, this is basically the components of IC engine. So, we have discussed a lot about this previously. Now, I will try to have a focus on different parts of the IC engine. So, just to understand the difference between SI engine and CI engine, and what is the 2 stroke, what is 4 stroke. So, we should have a thorough knowledge of the basic components of the IC engine. So, if you will see, so this is the main cylinder, this is the cylinder. So, the piston reciprocates inside this. So, we have two types of valves. One is the the inlet valve, this is the inlet manifold, and this is the inlet valve. This portion is the inlet valve, if you will see, right. This is the outlet valve from which the burnt charges come out. This is the inlet manifold through which we generally supply the fuel or air mixture, or sometimes air, depending upon the type of engine. Now, this is the main and important part of the engine. So, this is known as the cylinder, right. Inside this, this is the piston, this is the piston, this piston reciprocates up and down. Now, here it goes up to some position and comes back to a particular position. So, these 2 points I will explain later also. So, these 2 points are, this is known as the top dead center, this is known as the bottom dead center, between which the piston reciprocates. So, two important parts are in cylinder and the piston. So, these two bodies are cylindrical in shape. Now, we have a tight fit between the inside wall of the cylinder. Let us say this is the cylinder, inside this is the lining of the cylinder, inside this the piston reciprocates. So, we have tight fit between this inner wall of the cylinder and outer wall of the piston. So, how can make this contact to be tight fit? So, we generally use the piston rings. So, let us say this is the top view of the piston, and this is the top view of the cylinder, and there is some gap between the outer wall of the piston and inner wall of the cylinder. So, what we do? We generally apply, or we generally supply some rings on the outer side of this piston. So, here we have some slots. So, here we have some slots. So, inside this some rings are there. So, we supply ring to this. So, it becomes tight fit here, tight fit here, tight fit here, tight fit here. So, sometimes we give 3 rings, 4 rings. So, these are known as the rings, right. So, this is the connecting rod, this is connecting rod. It connects the piston with the crankshaft. So, it reciprocates, it oscillates and it rotates. So, like this, when fuel air comes inside this, it goes outside due to the different motion. So, we have 4 strokes. So, I will discuss in the next lecture, and it rotates. So, on this shaft we generally get the mechanical work. So, it means with the help of chemical energy of fuel we are getting the mechanical work. So, here we have connecting rod, and this is the pin which connects this cylinder and this piston and the connecting rod. This is the crank pin, this is the body of the engine crankcase, this is the sump where oil and engine oil is filled, and this is the crankshaft. So, and this is the space for supply of the cooling medium. So, like this we can understand the components of IC engine. So, if we will get some idea of IC engine components, then definitely we will understand the different classifications and working of different types of engines in the subsequent lectures. So, thank you for listening this lecture. Thank you so much.